Hello, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America, and my guest today is activist and attorney Lurie Daniel Favors. She is the executive director for the Center for Law and Social Justice at CUNY's, our family's, Medgar Evers College, and host of the Lurie Daniel Favors show on Sirius XM, Urban View. Thank you so much, Lurie, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I told you that I had so much fun listening to your show. I'll be calling you. I'm glad that you take calls. But let's start with the center because, you know, such great work is being done there.
Thank you.
Some of the founders, that's my generation, you know, of those are people that I knew as a reporter in my early reporting days who were instrumental in starting the center.
Yes. So I have to always start by giving gratitude to those who came before. And so this is a perfect place to start. Our founding executive director, as you know, Esmeralda Simmons, she and names that we revere, Al Vann, may he rest, Assemblymember Roger Green, we are so grateful for his continued work, and so many others, activists, organizers, attorneys like Michael Warren, Alton Maddox, may he rest, all of these folks who during the 80s recognized that New Yorkers of African descent, Black New Yorkers, and I say it that way particularly, we can get into the reasons why in just a bit, but they recognized that people who look like you and I needed to have a legal apparatus, some sort of institution that was going to be dedicated to using the law to figure out how to make our lives better. This was a time when we had rampant police brutality. The voting rights violations were awful. This was back in the day of the old machines that used to crank, and then the machines that were coming into our communities would break down the soonest. The housing.
This is all my, you know, yes, of course. This is my reporting life.
Well, there you go. And thanks to your reporting life and the work of people from that era, we now have, almost 40 years later, this storied institution that I first began as general counsel back in 2015. And then when our founder retired, I served as interim for a while and then was appointed as executive director almost 2 years ago now. So it has been doing the work that we do now is why I went to law school. So it's a real pleasure to be in that space.
So started, though, with the idea of police brutality being a major issue. Talk to us about that. How far have we come in the 40 years?
Well, it depends on who you ask, because frankly, there have been significant improvements. We now have the Civilian Complaint Review Board, which is a much more vibrant body than it has ever been, and yet at the same time hampered by the current leadership changes and shuffling about. We have had some phenomenal lawsuits that have been filed on behalf of Black New Yorkers who saw the worst of NYPD policing. And of course, we always want to say we know that not all police are a part of that sort of policing, but unfortunately, because NYPD is an institution, its capacity to do harm often outstrips the capacity of individual officers' desire to do good. And so while we now have the ability to ensure that folks are getting adequate representation, the facts of the matter is that with stop and frisk, which is a form of policing that myself and many others who were far more invested did a lot of work in terms of organizing and activism and going into the courts and filing the lawsuits, and really did an effort or had an effort to reduce those numbers, because at their height you had over 500,000 New Yorkers who were being stopped, questioned, and frisked on an annual basis. Black men, the majority of them, 85% Black and Latino men. And while that number those statistics are horrifying enough, what we often don't do is break down what that meant, because even though 70 to 80% of the folks who were being stopped, questioned, and frisked were Black and brown New Yorkers, 9 out of 10 of them were being dismissed from those encounters with NYPD with no desk appearance ticket, no summons, no sort of subsequent involvement whatsoever, which means that when they were being stopped, questioned, and frisked, they were literally being stopped for the crime of walking around in melanated skin. And that is terrorism, because if this were happening to white New Yorkers, where they were being stopped on a regular basis to the tune of more than 500,000 stops a year, we would recognize that rightfully as an act of terrorism, and we would respond in kind. But because it was happening to Black and brown New Yorkers, it was considered policing a norm. And so we did a lot of work to support the efforts of activists who were fighting those cases, and they won on a significant number of levels. And unfortunately, we are now under a new leadership, which has brought those practices back, has brought back some of the groups that activists fought so hard to have eradicated from the NYPD, like the Strategic Response Group, these groups that operate some have said more like gangs than actual officers. And while we were excited to see that the organizing work was able to have some of those units eliminated, we are now seeing the return, and not even that, it's also the return of that practice of stop, question, and frisk, which has been very troublesome.
And voting is also, we'll talk more about the police, New York City police in a minute, but voting was also a primary
yes,
focus.
And this is huge. And one of the reasons why voting rights for our community is so important is because if you think about it, from 1619 until right around 1964 when the Civil Rights Act is passed, we could be killed for trying to have a conversation about engaging meaningfully in politics, trying to engage civically. And yes, we had that brief decade or so of Reconstruction, but even that was fraught, that period after the Civil War, even that was fraught with political violence. And so that's roughly 46-ish or so years where Black community members were not able to gain the experiential knowledge that we need to understand how this system works. Now, that in and of itself is troubling, but as a comparison point, our white colleagues during that entire 346-year period were asking the tough questions. What does it mean to have a candidate that represents you? How do you fundraise? How do you create committees? What is a club? What does a political club look like? How do we hold someone accountable once we've got them into office? They were building the plane as they flew it, but they had a bird's eye view as to how this system works and what the vote meant to allow that system to function well. We did not have that. And when you don't account for that gap in our civic education and our voting rights, get out the vote work, then you're missing a key component. And so our voter education work really looks at filling in that gap and ensuring that our community doesn't just register to vote, but has the information necessary to meaningfully engage with the ballot.
And the whole redistricting,
Yes.
figuring that out,
Yes.
being carved out crazily of your right to power, actually, which is what it means.
Yes, and for us, redistricting is so important. This is one of the reasons why we are always so grateful to partner with organizations like Latino Justice, Pearl Deaf, and the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, because we recognize that, one, redistricting is a word that frankly does not inspire a whole lot of excitement. It's a boring topic, but it's one of the most important topics that keeps our democracy together. When I group you together or spread you apart based on your electoral power, and for just, if you don't mind, if I just want to, for people who don't know what redistricting is, it's essentially this process that takes place every 10 years after the census. The census is that survey that we all fill out in a year ending in 0, so 2010, 2020, we'll do another one in 2030, that gives the government a snapshot as to who we are, where we live, and how many of us there are in those spaces. And that's important because the resources that our communities need for schools, for libraries, for healthcare, for housing, for jobs, all of that is informed by and funded based on formulas that incorporate those census numbers. Unfortunately, a lot of us don't fill out the census as we should. We can talk about that in a bit. But
now Lurie is telling you why you need to fill that form out. You have a few years to get ready.
You do, and yet you don't. So I want all the pastors and faith leaders out there, I want all the community organizations to begin talking about census, and I'll give you a simple example as to why it matters. Let's imagine we live in a community of 100 people, 100 families. Let's make it even easier. 100 families, and let's call it Blacklandia. And in Blacklandia, this community of 100 families, all of us have one child in our family, which means there are 100 kids in this community. And let's say, according to the census formulas, if communities of our size fill out the census, the government will know there's 100 families, there's 100 children. Each of those families is going to get $1 for education for the following year. If all 100 of us fill out the census, then we will be fully funded with our educational needs. However, if only 30% of us in Blacklandia fill out the census, then according to the government, for the purposes of funding our education, there's only 30 kids here. They're going to give us $30. And what happens is in September, all 100 families send all 100 beautiful children to the school, and the school's going to educate them, but it's going to educate 100 children on a budget that's only appropriate for 30.
I love your explanation.
Thank you. I try really hard to make it salient to people.
That is absolutely it, in its essence. And so now the other things, you're excited because you have a brand new crop of interns who are working with you. Tell us what they'll be doing.
We just had orientation. We brought in a new group of 7 students from Medgar Evers College and an additional student that just joined us from Brooklyn College. So we spread the love around CUNY. But these students are going to participate in a campaign we have. It's a multi-year campaign called Our Future, Our Vote. And the emphasis of this program program is one that recognizes that while our seniors do a wonderful job of engaging with the ballot, and they're going to vote at numbers that make my heart joyful, our young people they're going to struggle a little bit. Looking at the data, we have to do more outreach, we have to do more education because they're simply not as tied to the political system. However, our elders at 80 who are voting are going to have the ability to impact policy that our 18-year-olds who maybe are not voting are going to have to live with for decades. And so Our Future, Our Vote is a campaign that focuses on 17 to 40-year-old New Yorkers. That's our definition of young. I know it's an issue for some people, but that's how we define young, 17 to 40. But these are predominantly New Yorkers of African descent, Black New Yorkers who may want to participate but don't understand how, can't quite make a connection between how their vote today is going to have an impact on policy tomorrow. And so these amazing interns are going to be a part of this effort where we'll be engaging in phone banking. We will have community programs. We have a film series called Cinema with a Cause that's all centered on explaining civics to our community through the arts. We're launching a book club in December, so I'm happy to share information about that as well. But these are students who, for the primary, we had a group of 7 students as well for the primary, and they made over 18,000 phone calls.
That's great.
Yes.
That's a great number.
Thank you. And over 800 in-person contacts with folks to explain to them, it doesn't matter for us for this purpose, not so much who you vote for, but that you vote and that you understand the why behind civic engagement.
Right. Believe in phone banking. I have my grandchildren doing it. You know, no
wonderful.
response when 8-year-old Sophie, she's 11 now, but when she would call people and say, "Are you going to vote?" And on the other end it would be, "Don't worry, baby, I'm headed right now."
Oh, see, now you just touched on something. The young people are our secret weapon. Nobody wants to hear from me anymore. I've got a lot of gray hair, and I'm technically not in that age group. But when you see a bunch of young college students with their T-shirts on and they're excited, you're willing to give them a chance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I love the way you explain it. You know, don't let the 80-year-olds predict how you're going to live the rest of your life, the rights that you're going to have. It's perfect. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even though I'm in the upper range of that.
Well, and we want you to vote, and we are excited that you do. We just want the fullness of our community in that space.
As long as you're gentle about it, right? You know, it makes perfect sense. So let's talk a little bit more about the film series that you have, because the films that you're showing are terrific.
Thank you so much. This was actually a project that was born over this summer. We participated in the John R. Lewis commemoration. It was to acknowledge the need to still pass the National Voting Rights Act. Thank you to those who fought so hard for us to have a New York State version. And so that was an event that took place in July, and we showed the film Good Trouble. And we got such a phenomenal response. Our voting rights coordinator, Lisa Lead, she was like, there's something to this. And so we showed Shirley earlier this year.
Which I love.
Yes,
right?
phenomenal film. Rigged, we also showed for October. November, we're going to be featuring Selma.
That's November 16th.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Right at Medgar Evers College.
That's Ava DuVernay's Selma.
Yes. Yes.
Great.
And so so this is going to be a series that takes us. We don't have a film in December. We're launching our book club in December, but we will also have the Cinema with a Cause series in the spring semester as well.
Well, you're doing fabulous
Thank
things at Medgar Evers, and as we always say, a part of the CUNY family.
That's right. That's right.
Now, I want to talk about your radio show, which is fabulous.
Thank you.
The call-in piece of it, your analysis of all things
Thank you.
political and not, you know. But this morning you were talking about a couple of things. One, let's start with our mayor, okay? Eric Adams, indicted now.
Yes.
And you had some strong feelings about representation and how that needs to be sorted out in terms of how we deal with this issue.
Yes, I think we have to first, again, acknowledge that history where we have not been able to really engage in a sophisticated manner when it comes to the ballot. And by that I mean there's a lack of information that a lot of us have, and not to say that Americans generally are as educated as they need to be about civic engagement, but our goal is to ensure that we have a civically educated and sophisticated Black electorate. And for me, one of the challenges with this very sad moment, I think it's just absolutely tragic that so many folks had such hope and such desire to see this administration do well. And so I think it's just a really sad moment for the city. But what has troubled me the most about this is that it feels as though for many in our community, we're reverting back to a representation politic that I think is just fundamentally flawed. As I said on the show earlier today, and as I've been saying for some time now, racial representation is not a civic skill. It is not a
I
civic
love the
virtue.
way you put it in the, rather than being an insult, it's just
Yeah.
an analysis of, you know, that's not a part of the political
That's right.
game as it's played.
That's right. If you are a part of our community and you're appealing to that affinity as a part of your electoral platform, then we as the voters need to know that your connection to us, the skinfolk versus kinfolk debate, your connection to us should inform how you engage in policy. It should inform the decisions that you reach when you are in elected leadership, but it is not in and of itself sufficient.
And your analysis, your assessment is that Mayor Adams has not performed well in terms of reflecting his black population?
I think that when you consider the needs of many black New Yorkers when it comes to education, when it comes to housing, when it comes to healthcare, we can look at some of the metrics and then we can make have an educated conversation, so long as that conversation is not trapped by, well, he's one of us, and so we're going to limit the discourse so as to not offend. So if we look at, for example, the school budgets and the fact that people had to fight for funds to be put back into the schools because of the budget cuts that our schools experience. When we think about the policies around community safety and policing, to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into policing overtime to clear the trains and the subway systems of people who are in a mental health crisis, while not also investing in mental health institutions that would be able to absorb the influx, to not have a concrete housing program that doesn't rely on some of the exploitative nature that developers can often bring to that discourse, to close libraries when we just had a pandemic that revealed to us that so many of our neighbors don't have access to basic Wi-Fi and services, only to have all of that put back after, well, not all of it, but a sufficient amount of it put back after there was a fight. Why are we fighting with someone from our community? If representation is something more than just a surface level discussion, why would we have to fight with someone from our community to not cut the very services that our community members rely upon? This incident that took place in Sutter Avenue with the shooting, where the public is put in harm's way by the very entity that is supposed to keep us safe for a $2.90 traffic fare or train fare. It is absolutely unjust, and it is really unfortunate because if we were not dealing with a mayor from the black community perspective, if this were not a mayor who had skinfolk, kinfolk analysis to rely upon, we would be protesting. We would be speaking out in ways that I'm simply not seeing, and that troubles me.
And so you seem to be upset that when the mayor first came out after the indictment, he was, behind him had black elders. And you felt that was a misuse of their support. But
Some of my colleagues called it elder abuse. The reason I was concerned, and not so much upset, but very saddened, is because here we have, before the indictment is even released, there's a press conference and a request that our storied, dignified leaders who have decades of giving their life and their work to improving the quality of life for all of us, to engage in this process that way. It felt very underhanded. And again, folks are going to have to decide how they end up, and this is not about a personal attack, but it is about questioning the capacity for this type of politic to continue, particularly when we have had black leadership at virtually every level of significance in city and state government. And to see it almost put on an altar so that it could be sacrificed behind this.
yeah. So do you think he should resign? You seem to not think that Governor Hochul should make him resign.
I have a fundamental, philosophical issue with the idea of black-led institutions or municipalities being taken over. We don't have a good history with that in this country, but I do think that I would echo the encouragement that a number of key leaders in our city have said, which is that you really need to think clearly about your ability to be effective in this moment. I'm always stunned when I tell my team to obey the law. I've never had to tell my team to obey the law because that was baked into my expectation for how we are going to operate. And so while everyone has to make their own decision, we have a primary election coming up next year where folks will be able to decide. But we really need, I'll refer back to President Joe Biden. There was a moment during this election when President Biden realized that his continuing at the top of the ticket might end up disastrously. And he made the decision that though I'm sure he thought he was the person for the job. No one runs for president without thinking they can do the work. He made a decision to put the people first. He made a decision that recognized.
Took a bit of persuading, however.
Oh, it did.
You know,
it did.
That's a big step. But he made that decision.
Yes.
And he did it. So you think we're at that point where Mayor Adams, and we are recording in the beginning of October.
Yes.
So whatever may happen after this broadcast.
Yeah. I would say at this point, considering today, at the first hearing, we also learned that there are more indictments coming. There are more folks who may be added to the list of defendants. It would be wonderful. This is a wonderful time for the mayor to demonstrate concretely that he has the ability to govern in the spirit that this community, this city actually deserves.
Okay, so now let's go back to the presidential campaign while we have the time. We got Kamala Harris and her opponent in a dead heat. It seems, an extraordinarily tight race. And as we record this conversation, last night was the vice presidential debate, which gave me a huge headache, I must say. I had such a headache. But it was great today to see that Tim Walz's favorability was skyrocketing.
Right.
Whatever people out there saw, they liked.
Yeah.
What was your response?
I wanted some rough and tumble. I had points that I was like, well, you should say this, and then he'll say that, and I wanted to hear more about Project 2025. I wanted to hear more about the attacks on reproductive justice.
Fight.
I was ready for the fight, but I wasn't the audience. The audience was middle America, undecided voters, persuadable voters. I'm sort of locked in, like there's no hiding who I'm rooting for in my personal capacity. And so I think when we saw those favorables increase, when we saw undecided voters say, no, that this one did it for me, it wouldn't have done it for me. But the fact that he was able to land and make a connection with folks who have not yet committed to either voting for this particular ticket or coming out to vote at all, that was significant. That was significant.
Yeah, so what about not coming out to vote at all? That seems to be a large part of the undecided. They're really not undecided. They've just had it with the process. So what did you say? I mean, you have your kids you're sending out, making phone calls. What's the persuasive line that you're telling them to give to whoever picks up that phone?
I'll tell you what's not persuasive. Anything that includes your ancestors dying for you to right to vote as an indicator. It's not persuasive. It no longer works.
Do not say it.
I mean, you can add it in at the tail end, but don't lead with it. One of the things we have been really observant of, as we have been mindful of that gap, that generational gap that exists in our knowledge with this system, is that when we can explain to people how what they care about is tied to the ballot, then we can talk to them about voting. So we will often ask people what they love about their community. Give us maybe 2 things that really frustrated you about your community, and then we'll take those issues and tie them to the ballot. But ultimately, what we let people know is, listen, we are living in a time of a resurgence in white nationalism, white Christian nationalism, racialized violence, the likes of which I certainly have never seen. I mean, I was watching this stuff on Eyes on the Prize. Like, I was a little kid thinking, wow, what was it like when this and that was happening? And now we're seeing the remnants of that come back in real time.
In real time.
And so what we let people know is, listen, this voting situation, we don't leave power on the table, as LaTosha Brown, the founder of Black Votes Matter, says. And what we like to let people know is you can choose not to vote if you want to. But the people who don't want you to have benefits are voting. And we try to break it down like this. Politics is just the science of distributing resources. Who's going to get the water, the food, the good schools, the good hospitals, the good housing, or the bad of any of those and more? So if politics is the science of distributing resources, and the resources are things that we rely upon every day, and politicians are the people we hire with our vote to make those resource allocation decisions, what we have to ask ourselves is, when we're not voting, who is? And do they agree with our vision of the world? Because if the racists are voting, if the white nationalists are voting, and they're picking the people that they want distributing those resources, well, then we might want to be present in that conversation, because we're going to have to deal with the lack of resources on the other side of that election regardless.
And how do you think Kamala Harris is handling all of this? Sexism, racism?
Oof. She is better than I. She is better than I. But I think she has her finger on the pulse of what's happening right now. And a number of folks have said, what changed? There's been this massive, joyous approach to engaging. We've seen energy, the fundraising numbers. I was on that call of 44,000.
Me too.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the reality is, it feels like she has been unleashed in some ways, and even her communication style, because it's a lot of the same personnel who are working with President Biden are working with her. But I think all of them have been able to really embrace her uniqueness in this moment. It has been thrilling to watch. And like I always say, we were going to drag, and I'm putting my partisan hat on now, so I'm Lurie the individual, not the executive director. We were going to drag Joe Biden across that finish line. It was going to happen. But I am so much more optimistic about our possibilities in this moment, not even just for this election, but for what it means for organizing and support of our effort to be more civically engaged beyond.
One of the things I loved was when Oprah asked her, even Oprah was saying, there's something different about you. Well, what is different? And what Kamala said was, well, when you're asked to step up, and if you can imagine, she was placed in a position where there was no going back. In fact, the night of the Biden-Trump debate, I said to my granddaughters, I said, we are tonight as close as we've ever been to a black woman president. And they were like, what? Do you really think? So there's no way they cannot choose her.
How prescient, how prescient. And I'm excited about this moment. And I'm hoping that it will plant seeds for us to maintain this level and exceed this level as we continue to build civically.
Well, as you and your students are out there making those phone calls, remember, don't start with your ancestors paid for this.
Though they did, and we are grateful for it.
Though they did. Yes. Talk about who's going to get the schooling, who's going to get the what, and sign up for the census. You are terrific. Thank you. Activist and attorney Lurie Daniel Favors. You can catch Lurie Daniel Favors show Monday through Friday live on Sirius XM's Urban View channel 126. That is it for us at this time. Thanks to you for joining us. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. We'll see you the next time. And please exercise your right to vote. It matters. Get out there. And now you can download the CUNY TV app in your Apple Store or in Google Play and find us there.